Hey there everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about comic book panel sizes. How do comic creators determine how large or how small any individual comic book panel should be? And I'm going to begin by giving you my three different categories of the factors that help you decide what size your comic book panel should be. So here's the first of the three. The main factors that affect a comic book panel size are how much art and or text needs to fit inside it. So going back to this example from Brody's Ghost, I think this is a fairly typical dialogue scene for me, and you can see how each panel is sort of doing a kind of a dance between the art and the speech bubbles, or word balloons as we used to call them. I never want to have my speech bubbles covering up important pieces of art, so you can see me leaving space over the heads of Brody and his friend Gabriel so as to get that dialogue in there, and that's sort of determining panel by panel the amount of space that I'm devoting. Like here, for example, you can see the word balloons are really taking up something like 60% of this panel, and that really, determined how much space was left for these guys. So I thought, oh, we got to do a long shot there. And so, you can see in each one, like here's the room that I've made, and even the shape of this panel is sort of determined by how much wording has to go here and how little of his face we need to see for this particular moment. So that's one of the three factors. Let's get on to the next one. Number two, how much space is available on the page? So this example comes from my very first comic book series, Akiko, which I did back in the 90s. And here you can see a typical page. We're going to be coming back to this, where there's a lot of small panels sort of crammed into a single page. Why did I do that? Well, I wanted to save space for this big final panel that would be shown at the very end of this particular issue, and give you that sort of to be continued feeling. And so very often as a comic creator, you are planning things out as best you can in advance with what space you have left. And that's why I thought this was a pretty good example of how, I didn't have a whole lot of space left. I wanted a big amount of space for this scene. This seemed like a big dramatic thing that deserved a big panel. This is just the characters talking to each other. We can get away with making those panels smaller. So that's the other big factor. Let's get on to the third and final factor that determines the size of your comic book panels. Number three, how much impact this particular moment is meant to have on the reader. So here's another example from Brody's Ghost. Mild spoiler, for anyone who's never read these comics. It can't really be avoided. But here we have a series of small-ish panels. I guess this one's fairly large. And here we see Brody turning his face at something he sees, and hidden behind the page turn is this very large panel showing Talia, the ghost, and Brody. The two of them are kind of the main characters. But what had happened in the story is that Talia had sort of vanished from the plot for a good number of scenes, and this is her return. We haven't seen her for a long time, and I wanted this to have impact, and that's why I gave this panel, in which not a whole lot is happening, they're just looking at each other. I made it extra large so that it would have impact on the reader. And so those are the three different things that we're looking at in terms of comic book panel size. The art and the speech bubbles, and leaving space, plenty of space for both of those things. Sometimes determining how much space you even have on the page can have you deciding how much space you devote. You're sort of carving up the page, and this one clearly I felt like here, that this was not such an important panel, so it's getting very small. This one I felt, well, we wanted a good look at her face, so the page itself is limiting how many panels you can put in there and how large they will be. And then finally, this idea of impact. Sometimes you're doing a really big panel just to give a certain emotional wallop to that moment. So now we move on to my different pieces of advice. Doing super rough versions of every page is a great way of working out just how much space each panel requires. You can then tweak things as you move to a more finalized version of the page. So this should be interesting. This is what I call a super rough layout. Some people refer to it as a thumbnail layout in which I'm really just trying to, using really scrappy paper, trying to just work out what's going to be in each panel. Will there be enough space for the various speech bubbles and so forth? And this has become an important part of my process. Now, what's interesting to see is that I don't necessarily adhere exactly to what I've come up with on this first go-round, and I thought you'd be interested to see how did this end up as a final sequence. Well, for example, the face I ended up doing from the side. Even the wording is completely different from what I did on that first go-round. And various things are changing. This one, interestingly, is pretty close. I must have been happy with that first sketch because I didn't veer away from that one by much. But I strongly recommend doing these really rough layouts. You're not committed to them at all. It's like I said, it's just on scrap paper. You can just feel loose and try things out and erase things. And it's great for helping you move on to that next stage of what I would call the final pencil. Not even the final art, but the final pencil that you are proposing as final art. And then you're able to, even tweak things further after that. Number 5, sometimes your goal is to fit as many panels onto a page as you can, so as to conserve space for a big sequence that is yet to come. This time my example comes from one of the later issues of my Akiko series, and I'm just going to show you quickly a bunch of pages where there are panels of relatively small size, and even when they're bigger you can see that it's mainly for accommodating all the dialogue that I wanted to get in there. And sort of page after page we have relatively small sized panels until we get up to this one where we feel like something big is about to happen, and sure enough that's when we really start opening up into these much larger panels that kind of lead the reader into thinking, wow, what's going on? Something seems to be building here. And then, of course, we have these final 3 panels, and pow! Or rather, crack, I guess I came up with as the sound effect. These 2 characters were at the core of the series, and the idea of this Mr. Biba character actually striking Spuckler across the face was a big pivotal moment in the entire series, let alone this story. So I knew that I had to conserve space for that, and I'm sure I sort of mapped this out, and that's why these panels were small, sort of getting these things sort of out of the way so that we could have the time and space to give this moment the impact that it deserved. So definitely, yeah, the pre-planning is very helpful in terms of determining the size and contents of each one of your panels. I often divide a page into 3 or at most 4 rows, stacked one atop the other. You can fit more, though. It all comes down to personal preference. So here's another example from the Akiko series. At that time, I had quite a lot of pages that were like these 2, with 4 rows. And then it's just a matter of deciding where do you split the rows into 2 separate panels. Again, based largely on, there's 3 different characters in this one, and quite a lot of speech bubbles, content. And so this one naturally became wider, and this one with just the 1 character and the 1 word balloon gets smaller. And so that was kind of how I would handle an awful lot of dialogue scenes, and by doing 4 rows, one on top of the other. Now, interestingly, lately I've gone more to a 3-row system, and I think if you look at Bone and lots of other comics like that, maybe even Raina Telgemeier's comics, I'd have to have a closer look at them. I think you're very often going to see a 3-row system, and that certainly is more typical of my recent comics. But you can imagine if I tried to do 5, boy, you're really packing it in. You're really kind of squeezing the art a little bit. And so to me, the 4 rows for this type of dialogue scene is maybe a natural limit, but you may be able to squeeze more in if that's your instinct. Number 7, the shape of a panel usually relates to the art it contains, the number of speech bubbles, or both. Now we've already touched on this a little bit in the previous examples, but here I'm going to pull out Miki Falls, my manga series from a number of years back, and I was using quite an unusual layout style in those days, in which I would allow myself to make oddly shaped panels that were really built around the wording, you know, the speech bubbles, the word balloons, and the art. And you can kind of see how, you know, here I had a panel where most of the action was happening over here. There wasn't so much over here except for a couple of speech bubbles. And so I actually shaped that panel and made it smaller, because that allowed me to do something different with this, where I could make this sort of diagonal, you know, the art inside this was a naturally diagonal type of image, and so I tailored that panel to this size. And then I was also doing something which I try to still do to some degree, what I called text snaking, where there was like a snaking quality to the speech bubbles that allowed you to instinctively understand the order in which they were to be read. But mainly what I wanted to talk about here was how the amount of text and the content of the art in each panel was determining its size and its shape. Number 8, a series of same-size panels, all in a single row or column, is a great method of showing the reader a subtle or gradual change. So now we're going to get our first example from the drawing lesson, my graphic novel that teaches you how to draw. And this is a pretty good example here of what I was just talking about. Setting 3 panels right next to each other that are exactly the same size and shape, so as to present a subtle or gradual, I think in this case it's more a gradual change as he adds shading to this drawing. Yeah, it's a great way of having the reader understand a process that's happening gradually or in a very subtle way from one panel to the next. And it depends very much on having the 3 panels be exactly the same size and shape. If I started to play around and use different angles, it wouldn't have the same effect. You really have to kind of get everything exactly the same, and then the viewer's eye, you know, the reader's eye is drawn towards the changes only. And it helps them understand that process. I'm going to show you a little sneak peek right now from my very newest book that doesn't come out until next year. It's called My Last Summer with Cass, and we're going to see another 3-panel sequence, this time showing how a facial expression can change quite gradually. So here's your little sneak peek. So there you have it, an example from a book that hasn't even been published yet, but I love to do that example, that type of style where you see the facial expression change from, in that case, I think it was like surprise to a sort of in-between expression, and then finally a look of anger or annoyance. I love to use the 3-panel setup that way to show a facial expression change. It's something I'm slightly obsessed with, and I think it's kind of a hallmark of my recent storytelling style. I just love, to me it's sort of like acting. It's like you're able to show your characters acting on the page. Number 9, I reserve extra large panels for important moments, presenting locations, environments, or the first or last panel in a scene. So here's a scene from Brody's Ghost. Interestingly, there's a little example here of that 3-panel sequence showing that he opens the box and he removes something from it. But that's not the example that I want to point out. Really, from this, what I'm heading toward is a big moment, and he is being made to set fire to all of his belongings. So once we get to him dropping the match and we sort of see the fire starting, I definitely wanted to use an extra large panel for that big moment. It was almost like a vision I had in my head, as if it were a movie or something, that, boy, that we really need to underscore the sort of point of no return here, where he literally burns everything that he owns, pretty much, in the world. And so, yeah, that is a pretty good example of using the size of the panel so as to make a big, strong impact on the viewer. Now, there were 2 other things we talked about: presenting locations and environments. and using large panels for the first or last panel in a scene. Let me go ahead and give you the example for environments. So here's another example from the Akiko series back in the 90s, and you can see me again kind of squeezing a lot into this double page spread so as to leave space for, boom, this really huge double page spread devoted entirely to the environment of what I called the Great Wall of Trud. And certainly this became a hallmark of my Akiko comics, and indeed almost all of my comics since then, of using the really huge panoramic panels to give you a really strong sense of a particular environment, usually a new environment that we have just entered for the first time. And my theory is that once you have devoted that amount of space, you know, to really giving the reader a huge amount of detail, they can kind of carry that environment in their memory as they proceed to the next panels where you can't really show the entire wall anymore. You're getting more into like individual parts of the wall, but they can keep this huge illustration in their minds and say, oh yeah, okay, I know where we are. I feel very grounded in this location. So definitely that is a really good reason for making a big panel, that is to give the reader a strong sense of where they are. And you just can't do that with a small panel. You need a bigger panel to make room for all the detail that you're trying to show to the readers. And then, as I said, the last thing that I tend to use large panels for is either the first or the last. I would say particularly the last panel in a scene. And here from the drawing lesson, we've got both, actually, because we've got a new chapter. But you can see me having devoted quite a lot of space to this last panel in which he sees his would-be teacher heading home for the day. And really the only reason that I made this panel so large is because it was the final page of the chapter. And I just wanted you to have that sort of feeling of, you know, like at the end of a movie where they pull the camera back and you just have this feeling of closure. So very often the final panel of a sequence, a chapter, a scene, in my storytelling style is to use a large panel just to sort of seal the deal or, as I said, give the reader this feeling of ending. Now it also can be really good for the feeling of beginning. This one is, you know, it's sort of double purpose. It's establishing the environment loosely, the sort of mall with Starbucks coffee. But also maybe a suitable example of how beginning a new chapter, I typically will begin with a large panel. That's not really a cut and dried rule. There are plenty of exceptions to it. But yes, the sort of first panel, last panel principle of devoting large panels is something that I have been following for years. So number 10 here, kind of a cautionary note. If you use large panels or splash pages too frequently, you may dilute the power of their impact on the reader. So I'm actually going to use one of my own comics as an example of having overdone it, possibly. This Miki Falls sequence has a splash page here where they're really just having a kind of a tender moment together. And then after just 2 more pages, boom, we have another big splash page. Now I would say this is justified as we turn the page to get this sort of shock of seeing that there's somebody blocking their way. And then there's this big fight sequence, and that builds, sorry if this is spoilery, but this builds towards Miki grabbing a rock and page turn, crack, smashing it right on top of this guy's head. Again, I think it's justified. This is a big, impactful moment. But then when he falls down and they continue on their way, they look up and boom, here's another splash page. I think maybe I did sort of get a little carried away with using too many splash pages all within a short amount of time, and it sort of does dilute the power that any given splash page has, you know, when you devote the entire page, so many entire pages to a single image. So yeah, cautionary note there. If you want them to remain special, you have to really sort of dole them out carefully, limit their use, because you can certainly overdo it. I think maybe I might have overdone it back then. Number 11, in dialogue scenes, I tend to use mostly small to medium-sized panels, seeking to squeeze as many into the page as I can. But not when the dialogue presents a pivot point of huge importance. So we've already talked about this a little, but in Akiko I did use the sort of 4-row system of packing in a lot of dialogue onto a single page. But I did want to sort of point out that as soon as I got to a moment that I wanted to have big impact, namely this one, on the reader, I got away from the small panels and I enlarged things just a touch so as to have that land on the reader in a bigger way. But certainly, yeah, like on a page like this, you can see me just saying, hey, you know, let's get through this. Let's get the dialogue rolling so that we can move on to the next part of the story. You know, certainly it's up to you. If dialogue is the heart and soul of your story, you might enlarge the panels and not be squeezing quite so much in as I was at that time. Well, we're down to our very last piece of advice, and here it comes. Number 12, if you've come up with a theory of panel sizes that goes against any or all of these principles, go for it. It's all about finding the storytelling flow that works best for you. So yeah, people who know me, you know I really don't like to lay down rules and say everybody has to do whatever. You know, it's all about experimenting, and I thought I'd just show once again some of these Brody's Ghost super rough pages where I was, you know, playing around, coming up with the way I wanted to do it. And certainly, if you find that, you know, you've come up with a different way of doing things where you use large panels all the time or never or whatever, you know, that it's your comic. You should feel free to do things your own way. But I do want to say that it's very helpful to do a rough version first. You know, if you're one of these people who just goes straight into the final, consider doing rough drafts before you get into your final work. It really does help. I have found a lot to give yourself options. You know, play around with different things before settling on what your final comic story is going to look like. I have shown you an awful lot of my books in this video, but I thought I'd just say, in case anybody wanted to get additional information about comic book creation, my Mastering Manga Series 1, 2, and 3 has an awful lot of material in it about page layouts, about all kinds of material, you know, different things that you can use for creating comics of your own. But I think it is time for me to wind down this video. I really hope you enjoyed watching it. I certainly had fun making it. And I'll be back with another one real soon.